Picture this. It's 1918. Deep inside a guarded government facility, the air is thick with heat and smoke. The roar of industrial furnaces drowns out every other sound. There are no speeches, no ceremonies, no headlines in the newspapers. Just workers silently shoveling silver coins into massive melting vats. Not scrap metal, not raw ore, money. American silver dollars, each one stamped with Lady Liberty, each one once trusted, saved, spent, and passed from hand to hand, are fed into the fire. They clatter, they slide, they disappear. And within minutes they stop being money at all. They become molten metal. Not dozens of coins. Not thousands. Hundreds of millions. By the end of this operation, 270 million silver dollars will vanish forever. Nearly half of all Morgan silver dollars ever minted, erased intentionally by the United States government itself. This would become the largest planned destruction of American currency in history. And almost nobody noticed. There was no public debate. No national outcry. Most Americans would live their entire lives without ever knowing it happened. Even today, the vast majority of people have never heard of the law that made it all possible. The Pittman Act. On paper it sounded harmless, bureaucratic, technical. Just another wartime measure buried in legal language. But in reality, this single piece of legislation permanently altered America's monetary history, rewrote the rules of coin collecting, and revealed something deeply unsettling about how governments treat money when survival is on the line. Because this wasn't about economics. It wasn't about inflation, interest rates, or monetary theory. This was about desperation. In 1918, the world was tearing itself apart. The First World War had already consumed millions of lives. Entire generations of young men were being fed into the meat grinder of trench warfare. Resources were stretched to their limits. Nations were running not just on factories and armies, but on belief. Belief in victory. Belief in allies. And belief in money itself. And that belief was beginning to crack. What most people don't realize is that some of the most dangerous battles of World War I weren't fought with rifles or artillery. They were fought with rumors. With whispers. With doubt. Because money only works as long as people believe in it. The moment that belief collapses, everything else follows. And in 1918, that exact collapse was already underway, threatening to take down one of America's most important allies without a single shot being fired. To understand why American silver was melted into oblivion, we need to look far beyond those furnaces. Beyond the vaults. Beyond the coins themselves. We need to understand how a war on the other side of the world turned money into a weapon. And why the United States decided that its own monetary heritage was a price worth paying. That's where this story truly begins. While soldiers bled in the mud of Europe, another war was unfolding far from the trenches. A quieter war. A cleaner war. And in many ways a far more dangerous one. Germany had learned something terrifying. You don't have to defeat an empire on the battlefield if you can destroy its money. By 1918, Britain had been fighting for 4 exhausting years. The cost of the war was staggering. Ships, weapons, food, fuel, all of it depended on a financial system that stretched across a quarter of the globe. And at the center of that system was trust. Not trust in soldiers. Not trust in politicians. Trust in currency. The British Empire ran on paper promises backed by silver. Silver certificates circulated everywhere, from London banks to colonial markets thousands of miles away. They were accepted because people believed Britain had the metal to support them. And for decades that belief held. Until Germany realized it could attack that belief directly. Instead of shells and gas, German agents deployed something far subtler. Rumors. Whispers. Carefully planted doubts that spread faster than any army ever could. The message was simple and devastating. Britain doesn't have enough silver. Those certificates aren't really backed. The empire is financially hollow. The target wasn't London. It was India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. India's economy relied heavily on silver-backed currency. Trade, savings, wages, all of it functioned on the assumption that silver certificates could always be redeemed for real metal. Once that assumption cracked, panic followed. People began demanding physical silver instead of paper. Banks faced sudden runs. Confidence evaporated almost overnight. And this is the part governments fear most. Because once people stop believing in money, no law can force that belief back into existence. Britain watched in horror as its financial system began to unravel, not from invasion but from doubt. If India collapsed, the empire would lose its ability to finance the war. Supplies would stop. Soldiers would go unpaid. Victory would slip away at the exact moment it seemed within reach. Germany understood this perfectly. If Britain fell financially, the war would end without another major battle. Desperate, British officials scrambled for a solution. They needed silver, immediately and in enormous quantities, to prove their currency was still real. So they turned to the only place on Earth that could help fast enough: the United States. America had entered the war, but its own financial position was delicate. Gold reserves were critical. Selling gold to Britain would weaken the U.S. economy at the worst possible moment. But silver? America had mountains of it. Hundreds of millions of silver dollars sat idle in vaults, far more than the domestic economy actually needed. Coins that represented wealth, history, and trust, but also something else: potential. Britain didn't need American sympathy. It needed American metal. And that's when an idea began circulating in Washington. An idea that would permanently change how the U.S. government viewed its own money. What if currency wasn't sacred? What if money could be treated not as history, not as public trust, but as raw material? That idea would soon be written into law. And once it was, there would be no going back. Every turning point in history has a face behind it. In this story, that face belonged to Senator Pittman of Nevada. Pittman wasn't a general. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't a philosopher of money. He was a politician from a state whose very identity was built on silver. Nevada wasn't called the Silver State by accident. During the 19th century, silver there had been so abundant it reshaped entire towns, fortunes, and political careers. Pittman understood silver not as an abstract commodity but as power. And in 1918, power was exactly what Britain needed. Pittman knew something most Americans didn't. The United States was sitting on a massive, underused stockpile of silver dollars. Hundreds of millions of coins locked away in vaults, serving no real purpose in everyday commerce. To Pittman, this wasn't heritage. It was leverage. His proposal was simple, almost elegant. Melt the excess silver dollars. Convert them into bullion. Ship the silver to Britain. America would help its ally without touching its gold reserves. Britain would stabilize its currency and stay in the war. And once the crisis passed, the U.S. government would replace every melted coin by buying newly mined domestic silver. Everyone wins. At least on paper. On April 22, 1918, the Pittman Act became law. Its official title was bland, almost boring. It spoke of conserving gold, settling trade balances, stabilizing silver prices, and assisting allied governments. Nothing in the language hinted at what it truly authorized. But hidden inside that legislation was something unprecedented in American history. The federal government was now allowed to melt up to 350 million silver dollars. Not withdraw them. Not store them. Not freeze them. Destroy them. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't an emergency improvisation. It was a deliberate, planned act of monetary erasure. To put the scale into perspective, some entire nations had never minted as many silver coins as America was about to destroy. And once the law passed, the machinery moved fast. Silver dollars were pulled from banks and treasury vaults across the country. Train cars packed with millions of coins rolled toward melting facilities in Philadelphia, San Francisco, and Denver, guarded by armed escorts. Not to protect the silver from foreign enemies, but from American citizens. Because if people had known what was happening, if they had understood that their government was quietly annihilating its own currency, there would have been questions, anger, resistance. So the operation stayed silent. Inside the melting facilities, the task was almost unimaginable. Workers weren't handling bars or ingots. They were dealing with individual coins, 270 million of them. Each one had to be dumped, processed, and fed into furnaces roaring hot enough to erase detail, design, and history in seconds. Liberty vanished. Eagles vanished. Dates and mint marks vanished. All that mattered was weight. And here's the most revealing part. The government kept careful records of how many ounces of silver were produced. But it kept no records of which coins were destroyed. A rare Morgan dollar was treated exactly the same as a common one. A coin minted decades earlier carried no more value than one struck yesterday. History didn't matter. Rarity didn't matter. Only the metal did. That indifference would create consequences no one fully understood at the time, consequences that collectors are still trying to unravel more than a century later. Because once you destroy money without tracking what you destroy, you don't just erase currency. You erase certainty. And when certainty disappears, chaos fills the gap. Once the furnaces were lit, there was no grand plan for what should survive. No list of historically important coins. No effort to preserve rarities. No concern for future generations. The melting crews worked the only way large bureaucracies ever do, by convenience. They took what was closest. What was easiest to reach? What required the least effort? Vaults were opened. Bags of silver dollars were dragged forward. Millions of coins from major mints like Philadelphia and San Francisco were fed into the fire first, simply because they sat at the front and center of storage. And this is where chance quietly rewrote history. Because not all silver dollars were stored the same way. Some coins had been moved years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with value or rarity. Old accounting decisions. Forgotten transfers. Bureaucratic habits no one questioned at the time. The most dramatic example involved the Carson City Mint. Carson City, Nevada had always been a smaller operation. Between 1878 and 1893, it produced far fewer Morgan dollars than the major mints back east. Logically, those coins should have been among the rarest survivors, if any survived at all. But they did. When the Carson City Mint closed in 1893, its remaining silver dollars were shipped to Treasury vaults in Washington. They weren't mixed in with the general population of coins. They were stacked in separate bags and pushed to the back of the vaults. And there they stayed. When the Pittman Act melting began in 1918, workers never reached them. They melted what was in front. They melted what was accessible. They melted what was easy. The Carson City bags sat untouched in the darkness while millions of more common coins vanished forever. This accident of storage created a strange illusion. Collectors in the decades that followed believed Carson City Morgans were extraordinarily rare survivors. Prices climbed. Stories grew. Entire theories were built around their supposed scarcity. All while millions of those coins were quietly sitting exactly where they had been left decades earlier. The randomness didn't stop there. Some dates that had once been common became rare overnight because most examples happened to be stored in the wrong vault at the wrong time. Others that seemed scarce before 1918 remained plentiful simply because the melting crews never reached them. There was no logic, no fairness, no pattern rooted in history, only geography and chance. And this randomness had a human cost. Every coin melted represented someone's savings. A farmer, a shopkeeper, a worker who accepted those silver dollars believing they were secure, stable, and permanent. Instead, their money became raw material for diplomacy. The operation worked exactly as intended. Silver bullion crossed the Atlantic. Britain shored up its reserves. Confidence in its currency returned just in time. Bank runs stopped. The German strategy of financial warfare collapsed. The British Empire stayed in the war. Victory moved closer. But the cost was staggering. By some estimates, only about 10% of all Morgan silver dollars ever minted still exist today. Hundreds of millions of physical artifacts, each one a witness to America's monetary past, were erased without ceremony or record. Future generations were left with gaps that could never be filled. And yet, the most shocking discovery was still decades away. Because some of those forgotten coins hadn't just survived the melting. They had been waiting. For nearly half a century, the truth sat in silence. The Carson City silver dollars remained hidden in government vaults through the Great Depression, through World War II, through the Korean War, and deep into the Cold War. Administrations changed. Crises came and went. And still, no one looked closely enough to notice what was there. Meanwhile, collectors paid premiums for Carson City Morgans, convinced they were among the rarest survivors of the 1918 melting. Price guides reinforced the belief. Dealers repeated the stories. The myth hardened into fact. Then, in 1964, everything changed. That year, the U.S. government stopped redeeming silver certificates for actual silver dollars. As part of the transition, Treasury officials began conducting routine inventories of remaining silver holdings. What they found should not have existed. Approximately 3 million silver dollars, untouched, uncirculated, forgotten. Nearly 2.5 million of them were Carson City Morgans, sitting in the same bags they had been placed in back in 1893. The shock rippled through the numismatic world. Coins that had been selling for hundreds of dollars suddenly existed by the millions. Decades of assumptions collapsed overnight. Entire collections lost value. Others were rewritten in real time. The government now faced a dilemma. Release everything at once and crash the market, or find a controlled way to unwind the mistake. They chose control. Through the General Services Administration, the government began carefully releasing the hoard over a series of sales. For many Americans, this was their first direct encounter with the hidden consequences of the Pittman Act. People realized something unsettling. The rarity of these coins had never been about history or mintage numbers. It had been about bureaucracy. About forgotten paperwork. About which door a worker opened first in 1918. This revelation forced a deeper question. If survival depended on chance. If rarity depended on storage. What did money really mean? The Pittman Act had done more than melt coins. It had changed how Americans viewed currency itself. Before 1918, silver dollars were just money, trusted, familiar, stable. Afterward, they became artifacts, objects to be hoarded not for spending but for protection. Because people understood something new. The government could make money disappear. And it would. That lesson would echo again in 1933, when private ownership of gold coins was outlawed and confiscated for remelting. By then, the precedent had already been set. The idea that personal monetary wealth could be seized during crisis no longer seemed radical. It seemed normal. The Pittman Act had quietly rewritten the relationship between citizens and their money. And its influence didn't stop at America's borders. By the time the last furnace cooled, the damage was already done. The 209 million ounces of silver shipped to Britain didn't just help stabilize an ally. They set a precedent that would echo through every financial crisis that followed. The Pittman Act proved something governments would never forget. In moments of existential threat, money is no longer sacred. It becomes a resource, a tool, something to be sacrificed. For Britain, the silver arrived at the perfect moment. Confidence returned. Bank runs stopped. The German campaign of economic warfare collapsed almost immediately. The empire stayed in the fight and history moved toward Allied victory. The Pittman Act worked. But success came at a cost that was invisible at the time. Nearly half of America's silver dollar heritage was erased. Not because those coins lacked value, but because their value didn't matter. Their history didn't matter. Their meaning didn't matter. Only their metal did. And that realization is the most unsettling legacy of all. Every surviving Morgan dollar today is not just a collectible. It's a refugee. A reminder that trust in money exists only at the discretion of those who control it. That savings, heritage, and belief can be converted into raw material with the stroke of a pen. The randomness of survival exposed a harsh truth. Coins didn't live or die based on importance or rarity. They survived because they were forgotten. Because they were inconvenient. Because a worker never reached the back of a vault. History wasn't preserved. It was spared by accident. For ordinary Americans, the lesson lingered quietly. Money was no longer permanent. Currency was no longer untouchable. If crisis demanded it, the government could, and would, reclaim what citizens believed was theirs. That lesson would resurface again and again throughout the 20th century. In gold recalls. In strategic metal stockpiles. In financial emergencies where history and sentiment were pushed aside in favor of survival. The Pittman Act didn't just melt silver dollars. It normalized the idea that money itself could be dismantled. And that idea has never gone away. Today, when you hold a surviving Morgan dollar, you're holding more than silver. You're holding evidence. Proof that trust can be broken quietly, efficiently, and without debate. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And when governments face desperation, the pattern always returns. If you want more stories like this, stories hidden in vaults, laws, and forgotten decisions that shape the financial world we live in today, subscribe to Finance Archives. Because the most important financial lessons aren't always written in textbooks. Sometimes they're the ones that were melted down and almost erased forever.